All right, let's go. Number 10. The Jiahu flutes. In September 1999, the archaeologist Zhuzhong Zhang and the American chemist Garmin Harbottle published 3 pages in the journal Nature about a set of bones from central China. The bones came from Jiahu, a Neolithic village in Wuyang County, Henan Province, dug through the 1980s. People lived there between roughly 7,000 and 5,700 BC. They grew rice. They kept pigs. They buried their dead inside the settlement. And in some of those graves, laid beside the bodies, were slender hollow tubes drilled with a line of holes. They are wing bones, specifically the ulna of the red-crowned crane, a bird that still winters in the wetlands of eastern China. The bone is naturally hollow, naturally straight, and almost exactly the right bore for a flute. 6 came out complete and playable, along with fragments of about 30 more. They carry 5, 6, 7, and 8 finger holes, and the count rises through the phases of the site, which means the design was not fixed. It was being worked on. In 1999, one of them was played. The instrument was catalogued M28, 2:20, a 7-holed flute from a single grave that held a matched pair. It was taken to the Music Institute of the Art Research Institute of China and sounded by an engineer named Xu Taoying, who used it to pick out a few bars of a Chinese folk song called Little Cabbage. That recording still exists. It is thin, breathy, and slightly unsteady, and it is the oldest playable multi-note instrument ever recovered from the ground. What makes this more than a curiosity is a detail about 2 millimeters across. Beside the 7th finger hole, someone drilled a second, much smaller hole. It is useless as a finger hole. Its only effect is to lift the pitch of the note next to it in the author's reading, correcting a tone that had come out flat and raising it by roughly a semitone. That is not decoration, and it is not accident. It is a tuning correction. Someone bored the hole, put the bone to their lips, listened, judged the note wrong, and went back in to fix it against a standard they were carrying in their head. Other flutes from the site show small trial borings, faint circular scars where a hole was tested before it was committed. Harbottle was careful about what this proved, and the caution is worth keeping. His own summary was that nobody would ever use one of these in a symphony, but that the people who made them clearly knew what an octave sounded like. The authors themselves declined to claim they had found the ancestor of any later Chinese scale. Other researchers have pointed out that octave-like structures fall partly out of the physics of a vibrating air column, and not only out of culture. What survives all of that is still large. 9,000 years ago, in a village of rice farmers, somebody was tuning. Set that against the rest of the record. These flutes predate Chinese writing by more than 5,000 years. They predate bronze, cities, the first dynasties, the Great Wall, and every empire the country would eventually build. Whatever those people could not yet do, they could hear a note sitting slightly wrong, and they could correct it. The finest flute in the collection came out of the ground in 3 pieces, with fine holes drilled along the break. Someone in the Neolithic had snapped it and bound it back together, rather than cut a new one. It went into the grave repaired. The bone survives, and the tuning survives with it, and both can be measured to the hertz. What is gone is everything the tuning was for. We have the instrument, and the intervals it was built to play, and not one bar of the music. Number 9. The song locked inside a fossil wing. The fossil is a pair of insect wings, pressed flat into fine, gray mudstone, each a little over 7 centimeters long. It came out of the Julongshan Formation at Daohugu in Inner Mongolia, from beds laid down about 165 million years ago in the Middle Jurassic. In 2012, a team led by Junjie Gu of Capital Normal University in Beijing, working with the bioacousticians Fernando Montialegre Z and Daniel Robert at the University of Bristol, described it in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. They named the animal Archaboilus musicus. It is a katydid, a bush cricket, And the reason they could name it for its music is that the fossil preserves the machinery that made it. Katydids sing by scraping. One wing carries a hardened ridge, a plectrum. The other carries a file, a row of teeth, like the teeth of a comb. Drag one across the other, and every tooth strike drives a pulse into a thin membrane on the wing, which radiates it as sound. The song is written directly into the geometry of that file. Alter the spacing of the teeth, and the frequency alters with it. The file survived. On the left wing, it runs 9.34 millimeters and carries 107 teeth. On the right, 7.81 millimeters and 96 preserved teeth, about 11 teeth to the millimeter, with the spacing widening evenly toward the base. That last detail is the signature of a pure tone. An insect that makes noise has an irregular file. An insect that makes one clean frequency has a file whose teeth are laid out to hold the sweep steady across the entire stroke. The Bristol team measured files and songs across the katydids' living relatives, fitted the relationship, and ran the fossil's numbers back through it. The answer was 6.4 kilohertz, a pure musical tone, low for a katydid, in a pulse lasting about 16 milliseconds, one continuous sweep of the plectrum across 100 teeth. Then they synthesized it. A sound from the Jurassic came out of a loudspeaker, and it was not a roar or a shriek. It was a clean, sustained, almost sweet note, the kind that carries a long way through still air. Except carrying a long way is the entire problem. A pure low tone is the most efficient signal an insect can produce for reaching a female across distance, and the reconstructed forest suited it. The plant fossils from the same beds describe an open stand of Araucaria conifers with nearest neighbors between 1.5 and 20 meters apart. Tree ferns filling the understory, an environment the authors describe as acoustically compatible with long-range signaling near the ground. So the animal was broadcasting, loudly, cleanly, on a fixed frequency for as long as it took, and every ear in that forest was inside the broadcast. The authors note that Jurassic mammals, such as Morganucodon and Dryolestes, small and probably nocturnal, could hear in exactly the band Archaebolus was using, and might well have hunted the things that sang in it. There were no bats yet. Bats were 100 million years away, but the pressure that would eventually produce bat-detecting ears in insects was already running, and this fossil is what one side of that arrangement looked like before the other side arrived. That is what makes the reconstruction extraordinary. It is not the novelty of hearing the Jurassic. It is that the note is a decision. Sing high and short and stay hidden, or sing low and pure and be found by everything with ears. Archaebolus chose the second. Its whole family did, and the family is still here. The scraper and the file are unchanged in principle after 165 million years. And on a warm night, they are running in the grass outside, in the hedges, in the dark beyond the porch light. The species is extinct, and its exact tone is gone. The instrument it played is still in production. Number 8. The conch shell from Marsoulas. In 1931, two men digging at the entrance of a painted cave in the French Pyrenees lifted a large seashell out of the deposits. The excavators were Henri Beguin and the American James Townsend Russell. The cave was Marsoulas, in the Haute-Garonne, a narrow decorated cavity whose walls carry bison built up out of red painted dots. The shell was a giant triton, Charonia lampus, 31 centimeters long and 18 across, with a wall up to 8 millimeters thick. They published it the following year as a ceremonial vessel, a kind of loving cup. It went into the Museum de Toulouse. It sat there for roughly 80 years, catalogued, labeled, and completely misunderstood. The layer it came from has been radiocarbon dated twice, on charcoal and on barebone, and both determinations land close to 18,000 years ago, in the early Magdalenian. That is the same world as the painted walls above it. It is also a long way from the water. Charonia lampus is an Atlantic animal, and Marsoulas sits in the Pyrenean foothills, roughly 200 kilometers inland. Somebody carried that shell over that distance by hand. When the shell was finally re-examined by Carol Fritz and Gilles Tossello of the CNRS in Toulouse, and a team of specialists who published in Science Advances in 2021, the reading changed completely. The tip of the shell was missing, and it had not simply broken. About 6 spiral whorls had been removed to leave a clean opening 3.5 centimeters wide, which is precisely the modification that turns a conch into a horn. The outer lip had been trimmed back by a series of struck removals. A CT scan found a perforation about 1 centimeter wide, driven through the internal whorls, in the position that would let a tube pass through the spiral. And around the broken apex there was a brown organic residue, interpreted as adhesive, the remains of something fixed into the opening as a mouthpiece. Then there was the ochre. Inside the aperture on the central column of the spiral are red dots applied with a fingertip. They are faint enough that the team had to pull them out with image enhancement. They match, in pigment and in technique, the red dotted bison painted on the walls of the cave the shell was found in. The same hand gesture, the same material, on the wall and inside the instrument. But here's where the object stops being an argument and becomes a sound. The team gave it to Jean-Michel Court, a horn player and musicologist at the University of Toulouse, and asked him to blow it. He produced 3 notes, and they were measured: 256 Hz, 265 Hz, and 285 Hz. Roughly a C sharp, and a D, sitting close together, low and enormous. The kind of tone that fills a stone chamber rather than traveling through it. That is the first recorded sound of an instrument from the Upper Paleolithic. Not a reconstruction, not a model, not a replica. The object itself played with the risk that came with putting 18,000 years of worked shell against a living pair of lips. Everything after that is inference, and the authors keep it narrow. A conch horn carries for kilometers in open country, so a signaling function is reasonable. The ochre marks tie the object to the decorated wall, rather than to the hunting camp. Marsoulas is a painted cave, not simply a shelter, and the instrument was found at its entrance. 18,000 years. And what survives is this. A shell carried 200 kilometers inland from the Atlantic. 6 whorls removed by somebody who knew exactly what removing them would open. A perforation driven through the spiral to seat a mouthpiece, invisible until a scanner found it. A fingertip of red pigment inside the aperture, matching the animals on the wall. And 3 notes, 256, 265, and 285 Hz, which are the same 3 notes it made then. Number 7. The caves that were chosen by ear. Igor Reznikov is not an archaeologist. He is a mathematician and philosopher at the University of Paris-Nanterre, and his real subject is ancient vocal music. In February 1983, he went into the painted cave of Neanderthal in the Ariège with the prehistorian Michel Dauvois to test an idea that had nothing to do with pictures. Their question was whether the placement of Paleolithic cave art has anything to do with how the cave sounds. The art in Neanderthal is roughly 15,000 years old. Bison and horses and ibex, drawn in black, deep inside a mountain, in a system that runs for kilometers. Their method was as simple as it gets, which is both its strength and its central weakness. No microphones, no loudspeakers, no impulse measurements. Reznikov walked the galleries singing, deliberately quietly, and listened for the points where the rock gave the note back to him. A resonant spot in a cave is unmistakable. The sound thickens, hangs, and returns with a body it did not have a meter earlier. They worked Neanderthal, Le Portel, and a third cave, Fontenay, which they abandoned because rockfall had sealed the original entrance and changed the shape of the space. What they reported from the other 2 was a correlation. At Le Portel, on their measure, around 80% of the images sat at or very near a point of strong resonance, and the pattern also ran the other way. The best-sounding places in the cave tended to be occupied by images. The truly unsettling item in the paper is a single red mark. In a narrow constriction of the Galerie Regnault, The two men located a point of strong resonance by ear before looking, and predicted that it would carry a marking. There is a red dot there. The passage at that point is far too tight to hold a figure of an animal. It is not a painting. It is a mark placed where the cave answers. So what is a red dot doing a kilometer inside a mountain at a spot too narrow to draw in, on the exact node where a human voice comes back doubled? Hold the question, because the evidence underneath it is softer than it sounds. Reznikov both chose the test points and judged the resonance, by ear, knowing where the art was. Caves are full of resonant spots, and without a model of how many images would land near one by chance, a hit rate of 80% cannot carry much weight. Cave morphology has changed since the Ice Age, and the acoustic variable is tangled with others, because the narrow, deep, smooth-walled niches that resonate are also the sheltered, private, paintable ones. Which is why the follow-up matters. A project called Songs of the Caves, led by Rupert Till at Huddersfield and Chris Scarr at Durham with the acoustician Bruno Fazenda at Salford, took proper equipment into 5 decorated caves in northern Spain: El Castillo, La Pasiega, La Garma. Swept scene tones, microphone arrays, full impulse responses, standard room acoustic parameters. Their result, published in the Journal of the Acoustical Society of America in 2017, is more interesting than a simple confirmation. Motifs in general, and lines and dots in particular, are statistically more likely to appear where reverberation is moderate and where the low-frequency response shows resonant behavior. The association is real, and the authors call it weak, but tenable. They also found something that quietly demolished a rival idea. In those caves, they could not find a clear audible echo anywhere. The long-standing suggestion that Paleolithic painters were drawing hoofed animals in places where echoes sound like hoofbeats loses its physical basis if the echoes are not there. So the honest position is narrow and strange at the same time. Nobody has shown that these caves were selected for their acoustics. Every space has an acoustic signature. Finding one proves nothing about intention, and the Durham team said so in print, warning that a measured resonance does not establish that singing or music was ever part of what happened there. But the marks cluster weakly and repeatedly, where the rock responds at low frequencies, and the deepest, tightest, most useless corners of these systems are not empty. Someone went in there with a lamp and a handful of red pigment, and stopped at the point where the mountain sang back, and left a dot. Number 6. Stonehenge. In 2020, the acoustic engineers Trevor Cox and Bruno Fazenda of the University of Salford published a paper in the Journal of Archaeological Science, written with the English heritage historian Susan Greene. The evidence behind it was an object built in a laboratory. A model of Stonehenge, 1/12 of full size, accurate to the monument, as it stood around 2200 BC. The reason for the model is that the real thing cannot answer the question. Stonehenge today is a ruin, missing more than half its stones, and a ruin has the acoustics of a ruin. To hear the complete monument, somebody has to rebuild it. And rebuilding it means either moving several thousand tons of sarsen or shrinking the problem. They shrank it. Working from Historic England's laser scan data, they modeled 157 stones, 3-dimensionally printed 27 unique masters, took silicone molds from those, and cast the remaining 130 in plaster, mixed to tune the surface absorption. The completed circle is 2.6 meters across. It went into a semi-anechoic chamber. Because everything scales, the test tones had to scale with it. The model was measured from 800 Hz up to 96 kHz, which is ultrasound to a human ear, and which corresponds to a range of roughly 67 Hz to 8 kHz at full size. Sources in 5 positions. Microphones in 20. 128 sweeps averaged at every point to hold down the noise, with a correction applied for the way air itself swallows the highest frequencies. The numbers that came out are undramatic, and that is the point. Reverberation time in the mid-frequencies. 0.64 seconds. That is a large cinema, not a cathedral. Speech inside the circle came out 4.3 decibels louder than it would in open ground. For scale, about 1 decibel is the smallest change most people can hear at all, and 10 decibels reads as roughly twice as loud. So the effect is real and clearly audible, and nothing like the acoustic engine the monument gets described as. Rearranging the bluestones in the model changed the result by amounts nobody could hear. And there were no echoes. In the 2200 BC configuration, the inner settings of stone break up the reflections before they can return as a distinct repeat. What makes this result worth an entry is not the acoustics of the interior. It is what the model did not find outside. Sound generated inside the circle did not project into the surrounding landscape. Sound generated outside the circle received no boost on the inside. The stones were not a megaphone aimed at a crowd on the plain. They were the opposite. Stand outside that circle during whatever was happening within it, and almost nothing reaches you. For a monument that has been read for centuries as a stage, an amphitheater, a broadcast, that is a reversal, the acoustic evidence describes an enclosure. Speech is a little clearer, music a little fuller, and the whole effect is available only to people standing inside the ring, among the stones, in a space that holds perhaps a few dozen. The comparisons sharpen it. Rupert Till has measured the surviving ruin at around 3/4 of a second. He has also measured a full-size concrete replica of Stonehenge that stands in Washington state and got 1.5. But that structure is concrete, complete and outdoors, and the material alone makes it a different room. None of these figures can simply be laid on top of each other, which is the whole reason the scale model had to be built. The Salford measurement is the closest anyone has come to the sound of the intact monument, and it describes something small, which changes what the site was for, or at least what it was capable of. Whatever ceremony ran inside those stones was not a performance to the landscape. It was contained, restricted to whoever was allowed within the ring, and inaudible 50 meters away. The stones are still standing on the same ground, in the same weather. The reverberation time is now known to within 0.03 of a second. Everything that was ever said inside them stayed inside them, exactly as the architecture intended, and it is still in there, unrecoverable, in a room we have measured to the decibel and cannot hear. Number 5. The Carnyx. The head is bronze, roughly the size of a large dog's skull, shaped as a boar with its snout lifted and its ears flared out to the sides. Peat cutters pulled it out of the ground around 1816 at Leachestown Farm near Desford in Banffshire, in the northeast corner of Scotland. Only the head survived. The eyes once held enamel, and inside the open mouth, mounted on a bronze leaf spring, there had been a wooden tongue, long since rotted away, which would have shifted and clattered as air rushed past it. Fraser Hunter, the Iron Age curator at National Museum Scotland, redated the object by its metal. The alloy contains brass, and brass in Iron Age Scotland means recycled Roman material, which places the head somewhere around the 2nd century AD, later than anyone had assumed. Excavation at the find spot in the 1990s showed the rest. It had been put into a bog on purpose, at a place used for offerings over a very long period. It was not lost. It was surrendered. What it belongs to is a carnyx, nearly 2 meters of tapering tube ending in an animal head. In the images that survive, on the Gundestrup cauldron and on Roman coins struck to record victories over Celtic armies, it is carried upright so that the animal's head rides well above the heads of the men around it. The written record is thin and worth quoting accurately. Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BC, says the trumpets of the Gauls are of a peculiar kind, and that when blown, they give out a harsh sound suited to the tumult of war. That is the whole of it. One sentence. Polybius, describing the Celtic army at Telamon in 225 BC, wrote of innumerable hornblowers and trumpeters sounding at once, until it seemed that not only the men, but the whole country round had found a voice. Neither writer uses the word carnyx. The identification is modern, made by matching those descriptions to instruments shown on objects like the Gundestrup cauldron. In 1992, a project led by the musicologist John Purser set out to build one. Hunter supplied the archaeology, the silversmith John Creed did the metalwork, the acoustician Murray Campbell at Edinburgh measured the results, and in 1993, the trombonist John Kinney became the first person in roughly 2,000 years to play a carnyx. And then in September 2004, a team under Christophe Maniquet of the French National Archaeology Institute opened a pit beneath a Gallo-Roman shrine at Tintignac in the Corrèze. There were around 500 fragments of iron and bronze in it, swords, scabbards, shield fittings, harness, about 10 helmets, one of them shaped as a bird, and 7 carnyces, 6 with boar heads, 1 with the head of a serpent. Every one of them had been deliberately smashed and bent before burial. In the 1st century BC, and one was very nearly complete. That completeness is what changed the science, because until then, nobody had the tube. Jean Boiserie, France's leading worker in raised bronze, hand-hammered a copy for the European Music Archaeology Project, and Kinney played it in the village church at Naves in November 2014. Then the acousticians measured the original, and the results are not what the reputation predicts. The bore is almost perfectly conical, and its resonances do not line up into the neat harmonic series that a modern trumpet depends on. The instrument is difficult to play. It is not as powerful as a modern brass instrument. Getting a bright brassy sound out of it is described in the published analysis as very difficult. And the great bronze ears are not ornament. They vibrate with the air column and radiate energy of their own around 400 Hz. And when the ears are blocked, that part of the sound disappears. That is the disturbing implication of the whole reconstruction project. This was never a loudspeaker. Every design choice pushes towards strangeness instead of volume. Carried the way the images show it. 2 meters of tube puts the source of the sound above human height, coming out of an animal's mouth, detached from any body. A tongue rattles inside the bell. The resonances refuse to settle into a chord. The result is a voice that does not sit anywhere in the natural world, arriving from over the heads of an approaching line of men. Whether that effect was intended cannot be measured, and the acoustics alone cannot prove a purpose. What can be said is that the instrument is difficult, expensive, fragile, made of imported metal, and useless for anything except being heard. The ground is still producing them. In the summer of 2025, archaeologists working near Thetford in Norfolk lifted a near-complete carnyx with a boar's head out of an English field, the first of its kind found in Britain, still being studied. Every carnyx we have was buried on purpose. Broken, bent, sunk into a bog, or packed into a pit. Put beyond use by the people who owned it. We can play the copies. Not one of the originals was left in a condition to be played again. Number 4. The temple with sound in its walls. 3,180 meters up in the Peruvian Andes, at the junction of 2 rivers in the Ancash Highlands, sits a complex of stone platforms and sunken plazas called Chavin de Huantar. 32 radiocarbon dates taken from the architecture itself put its construction and rebuilding between roughly 1,200 and 500 BC. It is not a village. It is not a fortress. Its interior is a warren. Narrow galleries cut through the mass of the platforms, no natural light, ventilation shafts threading between levels, and more than a kilometer of channels and drains running under the floors. People went inside it. That is the point of the building. In 2001, John Rick's Stanford project opened a small gallery beside the circular plaza and found 20 conch trumpets stacked inside it. They are strombus shells, incised with designs. They did not come from anywhere near Peru's cold coast. They came from warm water, hundreds of kilometers north, off what is now Ecuador, which means every one of them was carried over the Andes. The room is called the Gallery of the Conches. In 2008, a team including Perry Cook, Jonathan Abel, and the archaeoacoustician Miriam Kolar took 19 of them and measured them properly,
with microphones inside the player's mouth, inside the mouthpiece, deep inside the shell, and a meter away in every direction. The fundamentals run from 272 Hz upward, with a playable sounding range of roughly 272 to 340 Hz, around a C sharp to an F above middle C. At a meter, they put out somewhere near 100 decibels. Then, the same group measured the galleries, and the galleries are where this becomes an entry on this list. Reverberation inside them is short, generally under half a second. But the early reflections pile up so fast that the sound field turns statistically diffuse within 20 milliseconds. And the correlation between what the left ear receives and what the right ear receives is very low. Translated out of acoustics, that means the ear cannot work out where the sound is coming from. The direction is stripped out of it. Kolar tested that directly, inside the building. In one gallery, she set up calibrated loudspeakers in 6 positions, played recorded conch trumpet at 96 decibels, and put listeners at 8 positions facing different directions. The architecture degrades localization. People inside could hear the instrument clearly and could not reliably say where it was. The ducts are the part that is hard to explain away. 3 horizontal shafts connect the innermost gallery to the circular plaza outside. The central one runs in a straight line from the carved mouth of the Lanzon, a 4.5-meter granite monolith with fangs and staring eyes that still stands in the dark where 2 corridors cross, out to the open air. Measured, those ducts pass the frequency range of the conch trumpets, 10 to 20 decibels louder than the frequencies on either side. They behave like filters tuned to the instrument found stacked in a room a few meters away. How many independent ways are there for a stone shaft to end up matched, by accident, to the one instrument the builders left behind? The honest answer is that nobody can measure intention. Every number here is real and published. Every statement about design is an inference laid on top of the numbers, and the researchers who took the measurements are careful about that line. The unsettling part arrived recently, and it did not come from the acoustics. In 2025, Rick and colleagues published chemical analysis of 23 objects from a gallery that had been sealed around 500 BC and not reopened until 2017. Bone tubes and small spoons. The equipment of inhalation. The residues carried nicotine and alkaloids of vilca, a seed that delivers a powerful and fast-acting hallucinogen. The San Pedro cactus that appears throughout Chavin's art, held in the hand of a fanged figure on a stela from the circular plaza, did not show up in the chemistry at all. And the number of objects was small. Whatever went on in those corridors was not for everyone. So the assembled picture has 4 parts. A building that scrambles direction, an instrument loud enough to fill its corridors, ducts that select for that instrument, and a small quantity of equipment for delivering a drug that dissolves the boundaries of the self. All of it sealed inside a stone mast with no windows. The complex still works. Sound made at the site has been tracked more than a kilometer down the valley, and the rock face opposite returns it about 6 seconds later. The ducts still filter. The galleries still take the direction out of a voice and hand it back as something that seems to be coming from the walls. The machine is intact, tuned and running, and it has had nothing to do for 2,500 years. Number 3, the voice built for another human species. In 1971, the linguist Philip Lieberman and the Yale anatomist Edmund Crellin published a paper in Linguistic Inquiry titled On the Speech of Neanderthal Man. And it did something no one had done before. It produced the sound. Their subject was La Chapelle aux Saints 1, the most studied Neanderthal skull in the world. The problem with reconstructing any extinct voice is that bone gives only the frame. The tongue, the soft palate, the larynx, and the throat all rot. So Crellin filled the gap by interpolation, modeling the missing geometry on a human newborn, in which the larynx sits high in the throat. Lieberman ran the resulting shape through a computer model, calculating the formant frequencies of every vocal tract configuration the skull would permit, and synthesized the vowels it could make. The reconstruction could not produce the quantal vowels.
Those are the E, ah, and oo sounds, and they matter because they are acoustically stable. A speaker can be sloppy and still be understood. Without them, the paper argued, Neanderthal speech would have been error-prone, slower, harder to decode. Their phrase was that it was at best suited to communication at slow rates. So a voice existed, not a recording, a calculation turned into audio, of a throat that had been gone for 50,000 years. One thing needs saying plainly, because it has been misreported for 50 years. They did not claim Neanderthals were mute or had no language. Lieberman maintained the opposite until his death in 2022, arguing that people who mastered fire, tailored clothing, buried their dead, and passed on the Levallois technique could not have done any of it without language. But here's where the reconstruction turned on the men who built it. The anatomist Dean Falk pointed out that a creature configured the way the model required would have had trouble swallowing food. Worse, the method itself came apart. The whole reconstruction depended on reading the shape of the vocal tract off the flexion of the skull base. In 1999, two separate studies of growing children, one of them co-authored by Lieberman himself with Robert McCarthy, showed that the larynx and hyoid keep descending long after the skull base has stopped changing. The bone does not predict the throat. The man who built the instrument helped publish the paper that broke it. Everything that came after has the same shape. In 1983, at Kebra Cave on Mount Carmel in Israel, excavators recovered a Neanderthal skeleton with its hyoid bone intact, 61,000 years old. The hyoid is the small floating bone that anchors the tongue and the larynx, and no one had ever seen a Neanderthal one. In 1989, Baruch Ahrensberg's team reported in Nature that it was essentially indistinguishable from ours. That was widely read as the end of the argument. It was not, and Lieberman said so immediately. The hyoid does not fix the height of the larynx, and pigs have hyoids that look much like ours. A micro-CT and stress analysis in 2013 found the bone's internal architecture loaded like a modern human's, and the authors stated in the paper that this does not prove that Neanderthals spoke. Then there was the hypoglossal canal, the hole in the skull through which the nerve controlling the tongue passes. In 1998, a study argued its size in Neanderthals showed modern tongue control. In 1999, a second study dismantled it, showing that many non-human primates fall in the same range, and that in cadavers the size of the canal has no relationship to the size of the nerve running through it. A decade of inference from a measurement that measured nothing. What changed the field was giving up on the mouth. In 2021, Mercedes Conde Valverde at the University of Alcalá led a study that measured the ear instead. Her team CT scanned the tiny bones of the outer and middle ear, from Neanderthal fossils and from the half-million-year-old population at Cima de los Huesos in Spain. Then they built a bioengineering model of how much sound power actually reaches the inner ear at each frequency. From that, they calculated the band carrying 90% of it. The ear is a filter. This is a measurement of its shape. Modern human ears run out to about 4,300 hertz. The Neanderthal ears run to about 4,000, far closer to us than their own ancestors at Cima de los Huesos. And the region between 3 and 5 kilohertz, where the Neanderthal range had expanded, is precisely where consonants live. The T, the K, the S, the F. Those frequencies do not carry across a landscape. They are for talking to someone standing close. It does not tell us what they said. It does not tell us whether they had grammar or names or songs. What it tells us is that the receiving equipment was tuned for a rapid, consonant-heavy signal exchanged at close range. That is an extraordinary thing to recover from a skull that has been in the ground for 60,000 years. And it is very nearly the specification of the ear you are listening with. The voice itself remains a model. The audio clip that circulates online as the sound of a Neanderthal is a synthesis produced by Robert McCarthy in 2008 from another reconstruction, and it is a model of a model, built out of our anatomy adjusted toward theirs. 50 years of work has produced a precise account of what they could hear, a demolished account of what they could say, and a recording that is entirely our own voice wearing their skull. Number 2. The whistle shaped like a skull. In 1989, after 3 seasons of excavation beneath the streets of Mexico City, Salvador Guillem Arroyo's team from Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History finished work on a round temple at Tlatelolco. It was dedicated to Quetzalcoatl, the wind form of the feathered serpent. The site produced 54 offerings and 41 human burials. 40 of those showed unmistakable physical evidence of sacrifice, dismemberment, mutilation, cutthroats. One is cataloged Burial 7. An adult man of around 20 laid on his back with his legs folded up to his chest and his head tipped forward toward his belly, his feet resting on a sloping adobe bench. His right hand lay on his chest, holding a small ceramic object. A second, almost identical object rested on his abdomen. Both are shaped as a human skull, hollow, a few centimeters across. Both are whistles. They are not flutes. There are no finger holes, and there is no note to find. What is inside is an engineered noise generator, and its internal geometry was only properly described in the last few years. A narrow air duct narrows further to a constriction. Facing it, a hemispherical chamber generates opposing counterpressure. Between them sits a collision chamber, and beyond that a bell cavity acting as the final resonator. Air is accelerated through the constriction, runs headlong into the returning stream, and tears itself apart in the middle. The output is not a pitch. It is broadband noise with a rough, piercing edge, and the harder it is blown, the more it distorts. What makes this object different from every other ancient noisemaker is that in 2024, somebody finally tested it on people. Sascha Fruholtz and colleagues at the University of Zurich published the results in the journal Communication Psychology. They used original whistles from Tlatelolco and from the collection of the Ethnological Museum in Berlin, alongside replicas, and they ran 370 listeners through 7 experiments. The findings are consistent and blunt. Of every sound category tested, the skull whistle scored the most negative valence. It produced the strongest urge to respond, higher than any other sound in the study. Asked to describe it in their own words, without prompting, the word listeners reached for most often was scream. The dominant adjectives were aversive and scary, and the ratings kept placing it in a strange middle category, judged as neither properly natural nor properly artificial, as though something manufactured were producing a human sound. 32 of the listeners heard it inside an MRI scanner. The response ran through the auditory regions that decode the emotional significance of a sound, and then out into frontal, insular, and parietal systems, the machinery the brain uses when it is not merely hearing something but working on it. The playback in those experiments was normalized to 70 decibels. That is conversation. The whistle does its work at ordinary volume, which means what your hearing is reacting to is not loudness. It is the shape of the sound, and some part of the system files it under human distress before you have had any say in the matter. That is the disturbing part of the 2024 result. The object needs no belief, no context, and no shared culture to work. It was built to reach a nervous system, and 600 years later, it still reaches one. Which brings up the reason this object now needs correcting rather than explaining. It is the most famous ancient sound on the internet. Replicas sell by the thousand, and the story attached to them is that Aztec armies blew hundreds of these at once to break the nerve of Spanish soldiers. There is no evidence for that at all. No 16th century account describes a skull-shaped whistle, in battle or anywhere else. No burial identified as a warrior has produced one. None has come from a battlefield. The instruments the colonial sources do put on Aztec battlefields are shell trumpets, drums, and wooden fifes. The 2024 paper itself calls the warfare idea a presumed but so far unsubstantiated association. Arnd Ajay Both, the researcher who cataloged these whistles, points out that the scream quality mostly appears when the instrument is overblown, which is what oversized modern replicas encourage. Fruholtz's own assessment is that they would never have been loud enough for open warfare and work best in an enclosed ceremonial space. So what is a manufactured scream doing in the hand of a sacrificed man at a temple of the wind? The supported answer is smaller and much colder than the battlefield story. These objects come from temples and from graves, associated with the wind, God and the Lord of the dead, and they are found with the sacrificed. The Zurich team's own hypothesis, which they are careful to label a hypothesis, is that the sound belonged to the journey after sacrificial death. The destination was Mictlan, the Aztec underworld. One of its levels is described in Aztec sources as filled with winds sharp enough to cut a person apart. The whistle from Burial 7 is intact. It still works. 6 centuries after a young man was killed at a wind temple and laid down with his knees against his chest and one of these resting in his right hand, it was blown in a laboratory in Zurich. The listeners knew nothing about Tlatelolco, nothing about Ehecatl, nothing about him. They reached for the same word anyway. They called it a scream. Number 1. The instruments that were already perfect. On the 17th of September, 2008, in a cave called Hohle Fels in the Ach Valley of southern Germany, a team under Nicholas Conrad of the University of Tübingen began lifting fragments of bone out of a horizon a few centimeters thick. 11 were recorded where they lay. A 12th turned up later in the water screening. Assembled, they make 21.8. Surviving centimeters of the radius of a griffin vulture, about 8 millimeters across, pierced with 5 finger holes, with 2 deep V-shaped notches cut into one end for the player's lips. Beside the finger holes are 4 very fine incised lines. They are not decoration. They are layout marks, scratched to fix the spacing before the holes were cut. The flute is broken through the last hole, and several centimeters of it are missing, 70 centimeters away, in the same thin layer, in the same excavation season. The same team recovered the Venus of Hohle Fels, the oldest figurative sculpture of a human being ever found. 8 of these instruments are now known from 2 neighboring valleys, 4 made from bird bone and 4 from mammoth ivory, and the ivory ones are the ones that should stop the conversation. A bird bone is already a tube. Ivory is solid. To make a flute from it, the maker had to shape a naturally curved piece along its long axis, then split it lengthwise along the interface between the cementum and the dentine. Both halves were hollowed out. The finger holes were carved. Dozens of fine notches were cut along both edges to take a binding. Then, the 2 halves were rejoined with a seal airtight enough to hold playing pressure. There is no natural precedent for that object anywhere. It was designed. It required adhesives, cordage, and a plan carried through in stages. In 2012, Tom Hyam's radiocarbon unit at Oxford redated the sequence with Conrad, using ultrafiltration to strip out contamination that had corrupted earlier results, and modeled the outcome statistically. The aurignation levels at Geisenklosterle came out at around 42 to 43,000 calendar years ago. These layers hold some of the earliest traces of modern humans in Central Europe. The flutes are not a later refinement of that arrival. They are in the first layers of it. The truly haunting thing is what is absent from the sequence. There is no beginner's flute, no failed prototype, no clumsy first attempt, no instrument with the holes in the wrong place, and no marks to guide them. The oldest instruments our species has left behind are already fully resolved. Correct bore proportions, planned hole spacing, a notched embouchure, and in the ivory examples, a multi-stage manufacturing process with a sealed seam. Nothing about them looks like an invention. Everything about them looks like a tradition that was already running when it entered the record, which means the record starts in the middle of the story. The argument has been put cleanly in the philosophy of science literature on musical origins. These objects sit several conceptual stages downstream from the beginnings of instrumental music, and the earlier stages are probably lost for good. The first instruments would have been reed, wood, gourd, hide, stretched skin, and the human body itself, and none of that lasts 40,000 years in a cave floor. What we are looking at is not the origin of music. It is the moment music first became difficult enough to leave a mark. Reconstructions have been played. Anna Friederike Potengowski and colleagues built 8 versions of the Geissenklosterle ivory flute and published the acoustic measurements in 2023, and they quietly killed a popular claim while they were at it. These flutes do not play a pentatonic scale. On the reconstructions, the interval between the first and second holes is most often a tritone, and between the second and third, a fourth. The tone is breathy, weak at the bottom of the range, and surprisingly rich in overtones. It is a real instrument with a real character, and it is not tuned to anything a modern ear would call a scale. There is one more thing in those layers, and it is the reason this entry closes the list. The same caves, at the same dates, produce the oldest figurative sculpture known anywhere. Music and images arrive together in the same sediment at the moment modern humans reach Central Europe. In the 2009 paper, Conrad raised the possibility, hedged heavily, that music could have helped maintain larger social networks, and may thereby have assisted the expansion of modern humans relative to more isolated Neanderthal groups. It is a suggestion about bandwidth, not about weapons, and it has been contested hard. Others have argued that the radiocarbon evidence cannot establish that anything happened first, and that an ivory flute is better read as a costly display inside a modern human group than as an edge over another species. And the one piece of evidence that could settle it will not behave. In 1995, Ivan Turk and Janez Drjec excavated a cave bear cub's femur from a Slovenian cave called Divje Bab, pierced with aligned holes, lying near a Neanderthal hearth, in a layer dated between 50 and 60,000 years old. Slovenian researchers have defended it as an instrument for 30 years and built a playable copy that produces 3.5 octaves. Most specialists outside Slovenia read the holes as the tooth marks of a carnivore on the soft bone of a cub. As the paleoanthropologist April Noel has put it, most people in the field accept that it is a chewed bone, and it keeps getting called a flute anyway. So the question sits where it has sat since 1995. We cannot show that Neanderthals made instruments, and we cannot show that they did not. What is not in doubt is the vulture bone. 42,000 years ago, in a cold valley in what is now Germany, somebody took the wing of a large bird and marked out 5 positions along it with 4 scratched lines. Then the holes were cut, and the end was notched. What came out of that was a machine whose only function is to turn breath into pitch. Every instrument that has existed since is a variation on that decision. Every string, every reed, every drum skin, every pipe, and the speaker you are listening through right now. It is a tool for doing something that keeps nobody alive, feeds nobody, and kills nothing, and our species has never once stopped making it. We can hold the replicas and produce the notes to the hertz. We will never recover a single melody, or a reason, or a name. What survives is 21.8 centimeters of vulture bone, 5 holes, 2 notches, and 4 faint lines beside the holes where someone marked the spacing before cutting. It is the oldest object our species ever made that does nothing at all except produce a sound. And it was already good. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.